بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah, by the grace and mercy of Allah, we are continuing with our lessons in the book, the Mukhtasar, the short text on the science of Akhlaq, the science of virtues, the Fada'il, and what is also called the science of Islamic virtue ethics. Today we reach a very, alhamdulillah, very important part on our journey, and that is we have now reached the section on the sub-virtues of the faculty of the appetite. So as for those who have been following, we've covered, alhamdulillah, the virtues associated with the rational faculty, that is the sub-virtues of wisdom. And last week we also ended on the sub-virtues of courage, the sub-virtues that come out of the faculty of anger or spirit of the human soul. This week we begin on a new juncture, a new section on our journey, which will be the sub-virtues of the faculty of appetite. So let's begin a little bit with reminding ourselves of the faculty of appetite of the soul, which is known in the Arabic as a shahwa, sometimes translated as desire. But once again, we always want to remind ourselves that that Allah creates within our soul these particular faculties for important reasons. Just like how we spoke about Allah creating the rational faculty within the human, because it's a faculty that seeks the truth and to do what's right. There's also the faculty of anger or spirit within the human soul that seeks to defend itself and others from harm. And then we also have the faculty of the appetite or shahwa, whose purpose is to seek nourishment, and also to seek nourishment not for themselves only, but also a sort of nourishment which necessitates a continuation of the human race. So this is how we can understand the starting point of the faculty of appetite. But once again, remember, whenever we're speaking about virtues and vices, virtues are always a balance. It's a golden mean between the extremes of excess and the extremes of deficiency. And as we've seen before, what is that balance for the faculty of appetite? That is a virtue which we call temperance, right? A virtue which we call temperance, in which someone is balanced in their appetite. They're balanced in their desire for food. They're balanced in their desire for by balance we mean, and this balance is determined by the Sharia, right? Balance in terms of one's desire for food, right, as well as sexual activity, right? This is what we call the faculty of the virtue of temperance. And then we have the vices on the other side, right? We have the vice of al-fujur, or profligacy, in which someone's desire is excessive, such that it causes them to fall into the haram. And then there's also the vice of deficiency, and this is what we call khumud, which is inaction, where someone lacks a sufficient appetite for food, lacks a sufficient appetite to essentially continue nourishment of their body, such that it results in this vice, what we call inaction. So that's a quick summary of what we've taken so far in relation to the faculty of appetite. Now, the great Imam Adudiya al-Iji, in his text on Akhlaq, he mentions, just like how he mentioned for the faculty of anger, he mentions for the faculty of appetite 11 sub virtues. And he begins, what does he begin? What is the first sub virtue of the faculty of appetite? He mentions al haya, which is often translated to modesty, sometimes also even translated to shame, right? But let's explore this in more detail. Let's explore uh, what the great Imam Adudiya al-Iji has actually defined this virtue al-haya as well as what the ulama have spoken about it. So, so he begins by defining al-haya. What is it? Firstly, we want to keep in mind, right? Virtue, the al-haya is a virtue that grows out of a balanced appetite, a balanced shahwa. So what is al-haya as defined by the Imam Adududdin al-Iji? He says al-haya'u inhisaru nafs khawf irtikab al-qaba'ih. What does he say? He says shame or modesty, al-haya, denotes the inhibition of the soul out of fear of committing foul acts. Right? So it's a very broad and general definition of a particular inhibition of the soul. Let's compare this with particular understandings of al-haya, right? For example, whenever we think about haya, let's say with regards to a woman, usually it's in terms of her dressing in a particular way, dressing in a way in which she covers her aura, or dressing in a way in which she covers herself as a result doesn't draw attention to herself in a negative way, right? So this is true. This is a form of haya. This is a form of modesty. But as we see from this definition, right, there is more to haya. There is more to modesty. We can think about it from a man's perspective, not dressing in a particular way, but we'll see it in terms of lowering his gaze, right? When a man lowers their gaze and does not look at things, which are impermissible for him, this is actually uh, also a form of haya, especially, once again, especially if it is coming out of a particular inhibition of the soul, out of fear of committing foul acts, right? And here we see a great way where there is a link between our study of the virtues, our study of the fada'il, as well as the fiqh rulings in which we govern our everyday lives. Because one way we can think about the fada'il, one way we can think about the virtues, is that the virtues are fruits of our constant practice of the Sharia. So, for example, let's take the example of the man again. Initially, initially he might be lowering his gaze out of fear of punishment, and that's a very virtuous thing to do, right? Out of fear of punishment, and also part of that as well, out of a desire to please his Lord as well. But as he travels through his life, and he continues to practice this particular very important act, what he will begin to see is that he will begin to cultivate, by the grace and mercy of Allah within him, this virtue of al-haya, where now over time, rather than lowering his gaze out of a fear of punishment, right, he begins to do it out of a shyness, out of a modesty, because he knows that that's not something which he should be looking at. Whether because essentially because it's a gaze which Allah has prohibited, and he doesn't follow that, even though within him, right, there is shahwa, right? The man has a shahwa to look at particular things, but because he has been constant, but obviously no one is perfect. Everyone's going to fall into mistake, and as a result, we always have the door of tawbah. So, um, as he continues to cultivate, right, day in and day out, cultivate this particular virtue, then he begins to lower his gaze out of now haya, right? Out of now modesty, which is a very beautiful virtue. Likewise, the same thing which the um, we mentioned earlier, the example of modesty of the woman as well, right? Because as we've learned from our teachers, we understand that women have a desire to show themselves, right? And there's a particular uh, and this is something which Allah has created within the woman. But once again, but once again, through a constant exercise and cultivation of a virtue, of this particular virtue of haya, then Allah will bless this particular woman with this particular virtue of haya, such that she does she wears clothing which is modest out of a sense of modesty, rather than out of perhaps a strict following of the rules, right? So here we see so the point which I want to bring up here is that we see the practice of the Sharia, right, which is this revealed law, which is this light, this light of revelation, which we accept into our lives and we practice, and as a result of that, with our understanding of that, it is a transformative practice. It develops within ourselves, our souls, particular virtues, such as the virtue of al-haya, or what we can translate as modesty, and as defined here as the inhibition of the soul to commit foul acts. And in the Arabic, انحصار النفس خوف ارتكاب القبائح. Now, a very interesting tangent which grows out of a number of commentaries here on the text is that the ulama here, they speak about the notion of the qabih, which is the opposite of the hasan, right? So you have al-hasan, which is generally translated as that which is good, and then we also have the qabih, which is translated as that which is foul, that which is bad. And what's really interesting here is that there is a discussion that grows out, particularly in the science of kalam, also in the science of usul, is the question: where is the role of the intellect? Where is the role of the human intellect in knowing what is good and knowing what is bad, knowing what is hasan and knowing what is qabih? And this is a very fascinating discussion, because firstly, because there are actually many definitions to what is good and bad, and some of these categories the ulama have mentioned are actually known through the intellect, and some of these categories are known through the sharia. So let's explore this particular discussion to the extent that we can today. So generally speaking, when the ulama speak about what is good and what is bad, this can be divided into three categories. The first category of what is good and what is bad is that which is what we call yula'im at-taba', that which is appropriate or in line or suitable with one's nature. And the example for that they give is, for example, joy, right? Joy is good because it's good, it feels good, it suits one's nature, as opposed to, let's say, pain, right? So pain is bad. Why? Because sound natures would prefer not to engage in something that is painful, right? So you have joy, which is a sort of pleasure, right? Which is good, in that sense, in which is it is good. Why? Because it is appropriate and sound and in line with sound nature. And then we also have pain, which we understand to be bad. Why? Because it's something that people generally prefer not to have, stay away from, right? And this sort of understanding of good and bad is known through the intellect, right? And it makes sense, right? Because we know it's very natural for us as humans to whatever is in line and good and whatever is in line with our natures, right? Our bodies, we name that to be good, and then we whatever is not in line, we name that to be bad. So that's the first type of good and bad, uh, uh, which is referred to by the terms good and bad. And the point here is that this sort of good and bad is determined through the intellect, through the aql. Now, the second type. What is the second type? The second type of good and bad, uh, and which is also determined through the intellect, is the good which represents attributes of perfection, or what we call sifatul kamal, right? Versus attributes that represent deficiencies. So what's the example which is given here by the ulama? They say that an example of an attribute of perfection is for someone to be knowledgeable, right? For someone to be knowledgeable is good. Why? Because it is an attribute of perfection. And then you have, for example, as well, um, the opposite, right? Which is an attribute of deficiency, right? Sifatu nuqsan, right? And the sifat nuqsan, which is an attribute of deficiency, such as ignorance, right? The absence of knowledge, this is then deemed to be bad, right? So this sort of understanding of good and bad is also known through the intellect, right? So we have the first category, right, which is a good and bad, which is associated with the natures of the people's natures and their bodies, right? Um, and one really fascinating point about that is that this type of good and bad is relative, right? It's relative to different people, right? Because one situation, right, which is the exact same situation, right, could be good for good to one person, but at the same time bad to another, right? Maybe we can think what's an example of that. Um, what's an example of that? Let's say so let's say we have a transaction between a buyer and seller, right? And as a result of the transaction, we won't assume any cheating involved, right? The transaction happened, but the buyer bought it at a really good price, but the seller sold it at a not a very good price from his perspective. So that sale was good, right? That sale was good for the buyer, but bad for the seller. So we see sometimes, right, good and bad can be relative. And we spoke about the second category of the good and bad, which are attributes of perfection, such as knowledge, that's good, and attributes of deficiency, such as ignorance, and that's bad. So that was the second category of the understanding of good and bad. Now the third category, which is the interesting one, in which the scholars uh, of theology, al-kalam, and the scholars of usul, they differed on whether this type of knowledge can be known through the intellect or not. And this is the type of good, right? The type of good that represents things that one is praised for in this life, but also punished for, sorry, praised for in this life and rewarded for in the next life. And this is considered now good. And also, what is considered bad from that perspective is things that people would be maligned for or censured for in this life, and also punished in the next life, right? So this is one understanding. This is the third understanding of what is good and bad, right? And we'll keep it, and we'll keep this discussion for the third one simple, and we'll say that, and this is according to the scholars of the Hanafiya. Most of these things, right? Most of these things can only be known through the coming of a messenger, the Sharia, right? A form of the Sharia. That's how we know what's good and bad from this perspective. Things which are good because they are praiseworthy and they bring reward in the next life, and things which are bad because they are blameworthy and they bring punishment in the next life. Right? Most of these things are known through the intellect, but there are a few. Sorry, most of these things are known through the Sharia, through the coming of a messenger. But there are some things, some of this sort of thing, which is known through the intellect, right? Uh, uh, such as um, the obligation, right? The obligation to believe in a creator of the universe, as well as the obligation to be grateful to this creator who has given you so much, right? The ulama of the Hanafiya, they say that at this level, right, these sorts of obligations can actually be known through the intellect, such that the ulama of the Hanafiya, what would they say? They said if there was no messenger, a person would still be obligated to to uh, to believe in God, as well as be grateful, to his blessings in the form of belief in Him, even if there was no messenger. Obviously, the Asha'ira disagreed with this. It's a big discussion, but this is the view of the Hanafiya, that some of these matters are actually known through the intellect. So going back to why we're speaking about this, why? Because what is it? Because al-haya, right? Al-haya is um, the inhibition, right, of the soul out of a fear of committing foul acts, right? And what is meant by foul, the qabih, in this context? It's all of these different categories, right? Because um, the person who is modest, or the person who has haya, will not engage in any forms of these foul acts, whether, right, whether it's a foul act which is associated with the Sharia, right, in which such a person would be considered a corrupt person, right? A person of modesty, a person of haya, would have an inhibition to fall into things like that. Likewise, a a um, a uh, a person with haya, right, also would also not fall into forms of foul acts, which they could discern through their intellect, right? Because this would amount to a form of stupidity, right? And a person of haya or modesty, which is interesting because this usually doesn't fall into our understanding of what is modest, but the ulama of akhlaq, they actually include it too, right? Forms of what is foul, which can be known through the intellect, in which people who would engage in it would be understood to be stupid, right? The the person of modesty would choose to stay away from that as well, right? And and likewise, um, and likewise as well, um, so, and the likewise the modest, yes, the modest person would also not engage, right, out of choice, in anything that goes against their nature, right? Such as doing things which would cause unnecessary pain, right? Things which would cause unnecessary sorrow, right? So this is also interesting as well, right? This A person of modesty would also not put themselves into such situations. And this falls into those three different categories of the foul, of the qabih and the hasan, which we mentioned earlier. So, inshallah, we'll end our lesson with that, in which we spoke about the first sub virtue of the faculty of appetite, which is al haya, which we define as inhisar al nafs, khawf irtikab al qaba'ih, which is the inhibition of the soul out of a fear of committing foul acts. And we ask Allah to protect us ever from the committing of foul acts. But also, if they were to happen, we ask Allah as well to make us of people that are quick to tawbah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.